This video is all about the assembly process for the Division C tower build. If you watched the previous video in this series, we already have our triangular legs, but now I will explain the unique challenges involved in building the rest of this design. I refined my build technique 3 different times for this tower, and I think it's worthwhile to explain each version so you can hopefully avoid some of the early problems I ran into. Regardless of the rest of the assembly process, one of the things I always like to do is to prepare all the material needed for the build before starting to glue anything. This makes the build process more like assembling a kit, and there are fewer chances to make mistakes. Here you can see that I've laid out the 3 legs I want to use along with all the cross-member pieces. The more meticulous you are in this preparation phase, the easier the rest of the build will go. The next thing I always do is mark the legs at every cross-member glue joint. You can see I've created a custom ruler made from a scrap piece of wood that has markings according to the design I'm implementing. Here that means layers at every 5 centimeters, starting at 5 millimeters from the bottom. For my first build, I approached this in the same way as a 4-leg tower. Here you can see that I have taped the legs to the jig. Note that there are no nice grooves for the legs to sit in for this tower, so you need to take extra care to make sure that they are straight and perfectly aligned with the jig edges. Next, I turned the jig on its side and glued the cross members in place. Nothing too special here, although make sure you have wax paper under the jig to make sure you don't get glue on your working surface. Here is build number 1 complete and ready to have the top sanded flat. Everything looks great here, but I'm about to discover the biggest headache of building this design, and that is having the tower get glued to the jig. I did manage to get the tower off the jig, but I almost ruined it in the process. I knew I needed to address this problem with future builds. For my next build, I did the obvious thing and taped wax paper to each edge. This should really help prevent any stray glue from sticking to the jig. Because I said I refined my technique 3 times, you already know this alone wasn't enough to solve the problem. Again, I put the jig on its side and glued the cross members in place just like before. Don't forget to glue the center of the X's to maximize the strength of this design. Here's the completed tower on the jig ready to come off. It had other ideas though, and still did not want to play nicely. Here is a close-up that both shows what the problem is and how I like to get the tower off in these situations. You can see that the triangular legs are almost flush with the jig. That means that the cross members at the contact points are basically touching the jig. That is not ideal and the cause of most of the problem here. If I were to design the jig again, I would consider making the flat side of the edges just a bit smaller to give the legs more room to be above the jig. You have to be careful though, as you still want enough flat surface to be able to align the legs straight. Probably about 1 millimeter less would help a lot. As for my solution to a stuck tower, I temporarily tape a small triangle piece to the top of the jig. I'll include the link to the STL file in the description. Once you have it in place, turn the entire tower upside down on a flat hard surface and firmly press the legs from the bottom to pop the tower free. If pushing doesn't work, sometimes I use a hammer to lightly tap the legs to jar them free. With my cat supervising the process, I was able to finally get this tower free without damage. It was better than the first one, but still not as easy as I'd like. It was obvious I needed to address the other root cause of this problem, and that is using too much glue for those joints. To minimize the amount of glue used, I found it was a really good idea to glue the cross bracing on a level surface. That allows you to use a very small drop of glue and it doesn't drip away from your intended joint. Here's how I did it with a conventional 4-leg tower. It was easy to just lay the jig on its side and you're good to go. That's not so easy to do with a 3-sided jig. 3D printers are a wonderful thing, and I eventually came up with a solution that involved creating a custom jig stand. Here it is, taped to my working surface. For the next build, here's the jig carefully placed on the stand and then taped in place to hold it steady. I will provide a link to this STL file as well, but I encourage you to think of other possible solutions and come up with something better if you can. This worked well, but it makes the process fairly delicate as you need to make sure you don't tip the entire thing over while you're building. Something like a custom foam cutout that held the jig might be ideal. Here is a picture of the first side of the cross members complete with the jig on the stand. It does look a bit like an Imperial Star Destroyer, so that's pretty cool. Here's the completed tower, and it came off the jig much easier. It still didn't slide off with no effort, but it was much better than the previous builds. For reference, I will show the assembly pictures of build number 5, which turned out to be my benchmark build. Here is everything nicely laid out before any gluing. Here is Star Destroyer mode for the first layer of cross bracing. Now the jig has been turned in preparation for the next surface of cross bracing. You have to be extremely careful when you put a completed side back on the stand. You can see the part where the stand holds the jig is very close to completed cross members. Those will break if the jig slides at all while on the stand. Here is the picture showing the final cross bracing complete. Each time you turn the jig, you have to remove the tape holding it in place in the back. I mentioned in an earlier video about the usefulness of the giant cone cut out of the jig. It is really handy at times when working with this delicate system to be able to put your arm completely inside the jig from the bottom. That was a nice unintended surprise. Here is the benchmark tower complete and ready to be removed from the jig. Even this one required a bit of effort to remove, but it was by far the easiest one I built. Even after building 5 of these towers, I was not able to get it so the tower just slid off the jig like they would with the 4-leg towers. I encourage you to try different techniques and perhaps redesign the jig a bit to help. Hopefully this look into my assembly process for these towers has you thinking about how you can improve on my technique for your own builds. In the next video, I will show the material optimization process I went through to eventually get the benchmark build. Thanks for watching, and feel free to reach out to me with any specific questions.